Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental. It's this deep connection between political ideas, the policies governments make, and, well, what actually happens in the real world. We've got a stack of sources here covering a lot of ground, ancient thinking, modern challenges.
That's right.
Our goal, to unpack how these big ideas about governing really shape things. We'll look at history, a modern case study, even drill down into one specific industry.
Yeah, this isn't just theory for theory's sake. It's about understanding why things are the way they are. What happens when different governing philosophies actually get put to the test. We want to give you a really full picture, pulling from all these different viewpoints and sources.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. What is political theory, really? Our sources basically describe it as thinking systematically about government, its purpose, its nature. It looks at institutions we see every day, Congress, Parliament, whatever, and asks, should these change? How? Or maybe would changing them make things worse?
And what's interesting, as economist Paul Krugman pointed out, is you don't need to be a professor to do this. The moment you say, I think government should do X, you're basically an accidental theorist.
Right.
We're all kind of doing it, making little theories about what works or what doesn't.
Absolutely. And these ideas have super deep roots. If you look back historically, take feudalism. Our sources point out, maybe surprisingly, it created a kind of order from chaos. For about 500 years, that safety net, however basic, allowed for more travel, more trade, and that led to wealth.
Right, and here's the twist Karl Marx noted. By creating that very security, feudalism kind of sowed the seeds for its own end. Wealthy cities grew, merchants gained power, and they started demanding more freedom from kings. This whole push for more public say, it bubbled up through unrest, revolutions, especially in Europe in the 1800s, slowly moving towards governments with things like parliaments, even if kings are still around.
And think even further back. Ancient Greece. Plato was wrestling with this idea of the philosopher king, the wisest person rules, chosen through intense education and experience. And interestingly, he thought they should own nothing to avoid corruption. He even floated the idea of women having an equal role. Pretty radical for the time.
Yeah, very different from, say, the Roman Republic. They tried a republic after getting rid of their kings. Elected representatives, lots of checks and balances, Senate, consuls, tribunes. But the sources noted it was often really cumbersome, hard to get things done. So they often needed a dictator in a crisis, which raises that classic question, doesn't it? What's the right balance? Robust checks versus, actually being able to govern effectively. How much friction is too much?
Good question. Then fast forward to the Reformation, Martin Luther. He was fed up with the church, argued we're all equal before God. And the sources point out it wasn't a massive leap from there to thinking, well, maybe we're equal before the state too. Kind of let the genie out of the bottle for more political participation.
Which brings us, neatly, I think, to American conservatism. Our sources frame this as a branch, really, of classical liberalism. Individual liberty, limited government, free markets being core tenets. American conservatives, especially maybe after the New Deal, post-World War II, really emphasized less government in the economy. The argument being that high taxes, lots of regulation, they just slow down growth, hurt living standards.
Right.
The belief is people should choose how to spend their own money. And maybe too big a safety net discourages work, self-reliance. That's the core idea, individual responsibility, economic freedom. It sets us up nicely for the next part.
Okay, so we have these big ideas floating around, order versus freedom, efficiency versus checks, liberty versus the state. What does it look like on the ground today? Let's take that deep dive into a real-world example from our sources. California. Now, some of the sources we looked at present California in a pretty critical light, not just a state with problems, but maybe even a cautionary tale about governance. Some even use terms like American mediocrity.
Yeah, the sources definitely highlight some major economic and social issues there. For example, California has the most billionaires, right? But it also has the highest poverty rate when you adjust for cost of living. Nearly 1 in 5 people in poverty, another fifth close to it. That's like 15 million people.
Yeah.
Really makes you ask, what's going on when a state has policies that seem to allow for massive wealth alongside such widespread poverty?
And one clear reaction seems to be people leaving. The sources mention a population drop of over 500,000 residents in just the last 2 years. Big companies, too. Tesla, Oracle, Toyota moving headquarters, jobs, often to places like Texas.
And the sources point to specific reasons for this exodus. They list the country's highest taxes, income, sales, gas, electricity. Schools ranked near the bottom, 47th. Infrastructure, roads, and bridges ranked 48th. And they really emphasize high crime. It's noted that it's often the higher income earners who are leaving, heading for states like Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Arizona, places often with lower or no state income tax, often Republican-led. It suggests people and businesses are voting with their feet against the policy environment.
Let's unpack that crime issue a bit, because some sources use really strong language. San Francisco and LA are described by some critics as Democrat-run hellscapes or socialist crime pits. They cite things like smash-and-grab looting, attacks on police. They name specific district attorneys, like Pamela Price or George Gascon, accusing them of being pro-criminal or showing extreme leniency. Some descriptions paint a grim picture of San Francisco streets, talking about human waste, open drug use, and businesses like Target and Walgreens reportedly closing stores or cutting hours because of organized retail theft.
Well, the argument presented in those sources is pretty direct. If crime isn't effectively deterred, if enforcement seems lax, businesses and residents feel unsafe, undefended. The implication is that this erodes civic order, and eventually people just leave. It touches on that fundamental role of the state, upholding basic law and order. What happens if people feel that's failing?
Then there's homelessness. The sources say billions have been spent, but the problem's apparently gotten worse. There's that striking story about San Francisco clearing homeless camps right before Xi Jinping's visit. Governor Newsom even admitted it was, quote, true, because it's true, basically, cleaning up for important visitors.
Right.
And then LA building that luxury hotel for the homeless, costing nearly $600,000 per unit. Meanwhile, the state doesn't require photo ID to vote. The sources juxtapose these things to raise questions about priorities and standards.
It comes back to that key question. When huge amounts of public money are spent on problems like homelessness, but the problems don't get better or even get worse, what does that tell you? Are the policies effective? Are they targeting the right things? Or, as some sources suggest, maybe creating unintended consequences or just being inefficient?
Okay, let's shift to energy and environment. California's policies, described in some sources as a war on oil, and heavy regulations are blamed for refinery closures. They project this could lead to gas prices hitting over $8 a gallon by 2026. That's a 75% jump.
Wow.
And then there's the power grid, shutting down coal, oil, gas plants quickly, trying to close nuclear plants like Diablo Canyon. The result, according to these sources, electricity prices rising 6 times faster than the rest of the U.S. since 2011.
And the practical effect. Rolling blackouts. Governor Newsom actually having to ask people to conserve power. The sources call this a straightforward policy failure, even a Luddite conspiracy.
Yeah.
They ask, how are you going to power all those electric cars you're mandating by 2035 if you can't keep the lights on now? It's a fair question based on their critique.
Right. And wildfires are a huge piece of this environmental picture, too. The 2020 fires alone, they say, wiped out 16 years of emission reductions.
Yeah, massive impact.
And the sources argue these fires are often man-made, made worse by what they call green ideology that prevents things like controlled burns for forest management. They also point to water being diverted for endangered fish instead of building reservoirs that could help fight fires.
So a real clash between different environmental priorities and approaches being highlighted there.
The sources also touch on identity politics, like Governor Newsom pledging to appoint a black woman to an open Senate seat, having already appointed a Latino senator, explicitly using race in appointments. And the reparations task force recommendation up to $1.2 million per person for qualifying black residents. Huge cost, $640 to $800 billion estimated. Newsom hasn't endorsed it, citing the budget.
And other policies get mentioned, too. That proposed bill, AB 957, making it potential child abuse not to affirm a child's gender identity. Or the act decriminalizing street-side sex work solicitation, which critics say hurts anti-trafficking efforts. Plus things like Oakland's guaranteed income pilot, specifically only for minority families. It all raises this broader question from the sources. When policies aim for specific social justice goals, how do they affect everyone else? Individual rights, traditional legal ideas? Do they end up creating new problems or inequities?
And finally, the sources include direct criticism of Governor Newsom himself. Labels like tyrant, out of touch. They bring up the church lockdowns during COVID, the French laundry dinner incident, that massively expensive high-speed rail project ballooning from $33 billion to $100 billion, with doubts about ridership and environmental impacts still lingering. These are presented as examples of a disconnect between policy and practice.
Okay, so that's the broad state-level picture painted by these critical sources.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears completely. Let's zoom right in on a specific industry, dairy farming, and see how some of these economic principles and policy effects play out very practically.
Okay, dairy. Our sources point to a really interesting shift happening there. This idea that just focusing on volume producing the most milk possible is actually killing profits. Smart farmers are now optimizing for components. That means higher butter fat, higher protein content.
Quality over quantity.
Exactly, and it works. They mention a 1.65% increase in valuable milk solids, even while total milk volume went down slightly. It's a great
Scale really matter here, don't they? Like robotic milking systems. They're much more efficient, but really only on larger farms. The sources highlight a proposed 700 cow cap in New York State. They say it would devastate that state's dairy industry. It's the 5th largest because it takes away the economies of scale needed to survive today.
Which leads to that big question about regulation, right? When does a rule, maybe made with good intentions, become what the sources call misguided policy? Policy that just ignores basic economics and hurts the very industry it might be trying to help. And interestingly, the sources argue bigger, well-run farms can actually be better environmentally. They could afford precision feeding tech, for instance, cutting waste by maybe 18%. Challenges that small is always a beautiful idea.
And the global market stuff is fascinating, too. China slapped these huge tariffs, 84 to 125%, on U.S. dairy. Basically kicked U.S. suppliers out of a huge market for things like milk powder.
Yeah, tough hit. But, and this is wild, despite those tariffs, U.S. butter exports shot up 224% in a year. Why? Because there was a massive global price difference. It shows how, sometimes, basic market fundamentals trump politics, as the source puts it. You need to be diversified, strategic, because pure economics can still find a way.
There's also this bottleneck issue, right? Processing plants. Most run near full capacity, 85, 95%.
Yeah.
So when the spring flush hits that predictable 6-7% bump in milk production, there's just no room. They end up having to dump milk. Wasteful, frustrating.
Right. And while there's about $8 billion in new processing capacity coming online soon, which helps with raw milk demand short term, what if demand for the final products doesn't keep up? Prices could crash. The sources argue the industry needs to become anti-fragile, meaning able to get stronger under stress, especially with climate change, making things less predictable.
Like the India comparison.
Exactly. India's system, lots of small producers, less automation, proved more resilient to disruptions than some super-optimized U.S. operations. It's a different kind of strength.
This whole dairy discussion actually connects nicely to another source talking about green innovation. It says businesses are key, obviously, but you often need policy support for the big, risky, long-term green projects. Cites the UK as maybe underinvesting in green R&D compared to others.
And it suggests governments can use tools, taxes, spending, buying green products themselves to nudge things along. But it also gives a big warning about badly designed incentives. Get it wrong, and you get undesired effects, like we saw potentially with the cow caps or energy policy examples. So the bottom line for dairy farmers, according to these sources, focus on the science and economics, use scale, use tech, manage precisely. It's not just about more milk anymore. It's about the right milk, higher components, better quality for consumers who are paying more attention. They even note milk is scientifically better than water as a protein shake base.
Good to know. Okay, so wrapping up today's deep dive, we've journeyed from ancient political thought all the way to, well, protein shakes. We saw how ideas about governing have evolved over centuries.
Yeah, shaping everything from who gets to participate in politics to how much the state intervenes in the economy.
And we saw, through the lens of the sources discussing California, how a whole collection of policy choices can really add up, affecting everything from poverty levels and population movement to energy reliability and environmental outcomes, real consequences.
Definitely. And the dairy industry gave us that sharp, ground-level view, how business strategy, like focusing on components, interacts with big policy forces like trade tariffs or regulations, showing how both micro decisions and macro policies shape an industry's success or struggle.
It really makes you think.
And that leads to a final question for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've touched on, the history, the California example as presented in our sources, the dairy economics, what kind of society are we actually building with the policy choices we make? Are we finding the right balance between the ideals we might hold and the practical, real-world results, between economic realities and social goals?
Understanding these connections, these trade-offs, it really does empower you. It makes you more than just a bystander. It makes you that accidental theorist, right? Able to ask sharper questions about the forces shaping our world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you'll keep digging into these important questions on your own.